A family takes in an unusual German Shepherd puppy, not realizing it isn't a dog at all. Initially, they assume he's simply large for his breed, but his movements, his intense gaze, and his complete lack of barking make them uneasy. Their 7-year-old daughter develops an inexplicable connection with him, a bond no one can fully understand, until one night he saves her life in a manner no typical dog ever could. That's when they begin to dig deeper, uncovering a startling truth about his origins. What kind of creature have they welcomed into their lives, and why does it feel as though he was destined to protect their daughter all along? Before we dive into this tale, drop a comment below to let us know where in the world you're tuning in from today. And if this story resonates with you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. James Carter gazed at the instant coffee granules, melting into his mug, watching them twist and vanish into the steaming water. The faint morning light streamed through the small Queen's apartment's kitchen window, throwing long shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. His laptop screen shone with a slew of unread emails, each tagged with a red urgent flag from his boss. He massaged his weary eyes, his creased t-shirt and messy hair mirroring the disarray of their morning rush. The microwave clock flashed 7:15 a.m., a sharp reminder that time stopped for no one, least of all single parents. In the next room, Mia sat at their modest kitchen table, her Hello Kitty backpack leaning against her chair's leg. Her tiny hand moved automatically across a sheet of paper, pulling a chipped blue crayon in endless loops. Her cereal bowl sat neglected, the milk gradually softening the Cheerios into a soggy mess. James observed his daughter, his chest tightening with pain. Nearly a year had passed since Lydia's abrupt passing, an aneurysm that took her on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Mia hadn't uttered a single word since, as though her voice had vanished into the void alongside her mother. "Those circles look great, sweetheart," James said, attempting to infuse his tone with warmth. "How about we add more colors, maybe turn it into a rainbow?" Mia's only reply was to press the crayon down harder, her long brown hair falling forward to form a barrier between them. James knew that gesture well. It was her way of shutting out a world that felt too overwhelming, too frightening. He turned to pack her lunch, grabbing her favorite sandwich bread. "Peanut butter and jelly today," he said. "Or should we be bold and go for ham and cheese?" His light-hearted comment earned a faint nod. PB&J it was. He trimmed the crusts with care, just as Lydia always had. Their walk to school was a daily test. Mia's small hand clutched his tightly as they maneuvered through the crowded Queen's sidewalks. A taxi blared its horn at a jaywalker, making Mia flinch and press closer to James's side. When a chocolate lab, led by its owner, barked eagerly at a squirrel, Mia practically burrowed into James's jacket. "It's all right, Mia girl," he whispered, using Lydia's old pet name for her. "We're almost there." PS 173 came into view, its brick exterior a familiar landmark now. Mrs. Lim, Mia's first-grade teacher, stood at the entrance with her usual gentle smile. She was one of the few who seemed to grasp Mia's silence. It wasn't just defiance or trauma. It was her shield against a world that had stopped making sense overnight. "Good morning, Mia," Mrs. Lim said softly, extending her hand. Mia loosened her tight grip on James's fingers and took the teacher's hand, though her shoulders stayed rigid. James watched until they vanished inside, then glanced at his phone. He was already late for work. The co-working space hummed with the energy of young professionals and startup founders, their conversations about SEO strategies and market trends, creating a steady buzz. James settled into his usual spot, immediately opening the overdue design files for the Peterson account. "James." He looked up to see Rachel standing over his desk, her neatly styled hair and sharp blazer a stark contrast to his disheveled look. His manager's face held a careful blend of concern and frustration. "Can we talk?" She motioned toward one of the glass-walled meeting rooms. The discussion that followed was all too familiar. Missed deadlines, slipping quality, clients requesting other designers. James sat there, nodding at the right moments, his mind racing, with calculations, rent, groceries, Mia's therapy sessions. "Look," Rachel said, her tone softening, "I know you're going through a lot, but if this doesn't improve, we might have to shift you to a freelance role." The words struck him like a punch. Freelance meant no benefits, no insurance, no therapy for Mia. "I understand," he managed to say. "It won't happen again." But they both knew it likely would. That evening, after tucking Mia into bed, with only a quiet hug for good night, James sat in the living room with his laptop. The day's failures pressed down on him. Another missed deadline. Mia's uneaten lunch returned in her backpack. The growing emotional gap between him and his daughter. Almost on autopilot, his fingers typed "Dog Adoption NYC" into the search bar. Mia used to endlessly chatter about wanting a dog. Before, she'd invent names for their future pet, sketch pictures of herself walking a dog in the park, and weave long tales about their imagined adventures. The shelter's website displayed page after page of eager faces. James was about to shut the laptop. It was a reckless idea, adding more responsibility to their already fragile situation, when he saw him. The German Shepherd puppy was scrawny, with oversized paws hinting at future growth. But it was his. Eyes that caught James's attention, deep brown, somehow sorrowful yet kind. The description was brief. Found behind warehouse, no tags, calm, approx 5 months. James's cursor lingered over the bookmark icon. It was impractical. Their apartment barely fit 2 people, and he was already struggling to keep their lives together. But something about those eyes drew him in. He clicked the bookmark button, then quickly closed the laptop before he could reconsider. The next morning, dark clouds loomed low over Queens, releasing a steady drizzle that turned the city streets into a maze of puddles and slick concrete. James sat at his desk in the co-working space, watching raindrops race down the window, while his phone displayed Mia's school number. "Mr. Carter," the school secretary's voice crackled through the speaker. "Mia's having a tough morning. She's in the counselor's office." James's stomach knotted. "I'll be right there." He gathered his laptop and jacket, sending Rachel a quick email about a family emergency. The subway ride to PS 173 felt endless, each stop dragging, on as his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. The school counselor's office was decorated in calming blues and greens, with motivational posters lining the walls. Mia sat in an oversized armchair, her small frame nearly swallowed by the cushions. Her expression was blank, but her hands twisted the hem of her shirt into tight knots. "She had a panic attack during music class," the counselor explained softly. "The thunder startled her." James knelt in front of his daughter. "Hey, Mia girl, want to get out of here?" Mia's eyes met his briefly before darting away, but she stood and reached for his hand. As they walked through the rain-slicked streets, James made a decision. "I have a surprise for you," he said, steering them toward the subway station. Mia didn't respond, but she followed without hesitation. The animal shelter was nestled between a laundromat and a discount furniture store, its worn exterior brightened by painted paw prints on the windows. A bell jingled as they entered, and the scent of dog food and cleaning supplies filled the air. Ellen, the shelter manager, looked up from her desk. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, dressed in scrubs adorned with cartoon dogs and practical sneakers, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. "You must be James," she said, standing. "We spoke on the phone." Her gaze shifted to Mia, softening at the sight of the quiet child. "And this must be Mia." Mia pressed closer to James's side, but her eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of kennels visible through the doorway. For the first time in months, James saw a spark of something in her expression. Curiosity. "Would you like to meet him?" Ellen asked, addressing Mia directly. The kennels lined both walls of a long hallway, most housing dogs that barked and wagged as they passed. Mia flinched at the noise but kept walking, her steps growing more determined as they approached the end of the row. "Here he is," Ellen said, stopping at the last kennel. The German shepherd puppy sat quietly in his cage, watching them with those same sad, intelligent eyes James had seen in the photo. Up close, his poor condition was more evident, ribs visible through his thin coat, patches of fur missing from what appeared to be mange. But there was a certain dignity in how he carried himself, something almost noble despite his state. Mia stepped forward without prompting, breaking away from James's hand. She approached the kennel door slowly, her small fingers reaching out to touch the wire mesh. The puppy stood, and James realized with a jolt just how large he already was. His head nearly reached Mia's chest, even while sitting. Those oversized paws weren't just puppy clumsiness. They hinted at significant size to come. The dog didn't bark or leap. Instead, he lifted one massive paw with deliberate gentleness and pressed it against the wire where Mia's hand rested. The connection was immediate and undeniable. Something passed between the child and the animal that made James's throat tighten with emotion. "I should warn you," Ellen said quietly, observing the interaction. "He's growing fast, really fast. Might be bigger than you expect. We're not entirely sure of his breeding." James nodded, barely listening. Mia had pressed her forehead against the kennel door, and the puppy mirrored her position on the other side. It was the most engagement she'd shown with any living being since her mother's death. "We'll take him," James said. The paperwork took 30 minutes. The puppy sat calmly through his final checkup, accepting his shots without a fuss. Ellen provided them with a basic collar, leash, and a small bag of food to get them started. "Good luck," she said as they left, a knowing look in her eyes. The rain had settled into a fine mist as they made their way home. The puppy walked, perfectly on the leash, staying close to Mia's side as if he'd been trained for the role. His size was more noticeable on the street. Passers-by gave them curious glances, likely wondering about the odd trio, the disheveled man, the silent child, and the unusually large puppy with watchful eyes. Their apartment felt more cramped than ever when they arrived. The puppy moved cautiously through the living room, his large frame awkwardly navigating around the coffee table and couch. He bumped into the TV stand, making it wobble, but caught himself with surprising grace. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, observing his exploration. The puppy completed his tour of the room and came to sit in front of her, his tail sweeping once across the carpet. Then it happened. "Ranger," Mia whispered, her voice rough from disuse but unmistakable. James, who had been filling a bowl with water in the kitchen, nearly dropped it. He stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to disrupt whatever magic had, allowed his daughter's voice to break through its long silence. Mia didn't repeat the word. She reached out and touched the puppy's, Ranger's ear, then returned to her usual silence. But something had shifted. The apartment felt different, as if the air itself had changed. That night, after Mia had gone to bed with Ranger lying across her doorway like a guardian, James sat at the kitchen table with the new collar they'd bought at the pet store on the way home. The tag-making machine had been easy to use. Now he held the small metal disc in his hand, running his thumb over the freshly engraved letters. Ranger Carter, Queens, New York. 3 days had passed since Ranger joined the Carter family, and already their morning routine had adjusted to include their new member. The apartment felt altered, not just because of the massive puppy taking up space, but because of the subtle shifts in Mia's behavior. James stood in the kitchen, mechanically stirring instant coffee while checking his work email on his phone. The familiar ping of incoming messages made his stomach tighten. 3 from Rachel already, and it wasn't even 7 a.m. But his attention was drawn to the scene in the living room. Mia sat at the coffee table, actually eating her cereal, instead of just pushing it around. Ranger lay beside her, his huge head resting near her feet. Every few minutes, he would gently nudge her hand with his nose, and the corners of Mia's mouth would lift slightly, not quite a full smile, but more expression than James had seen in months. The dog's growth was astonishing. In just 3 days, his ribs had vanished under a healthier coat, and his frame seemed to have expanded overnight. The collar they'd bought already needed to be adjusted to its larger setting. Time for school, Mia, James called softly, packing her lunch with one hand while trying to respond to emails with the other. Before he could finish, Ranger was already at the door, sitting perfectly still, his eyes focused and alert. It was uncanny how quickly he'd learned their schedule. He hadn't needed any training. He simply observed and adapted, as if he'd been preparing for this role his entire life. Mia gathered her backpack without protest, another change since Ranger's arrival. Before, getting her ready for school had often involved tears or, at least, silent resistance. Now she moved with purpose, even if she still hadn't spoken since that first whispered Ranger. The walk to school was interrupted by a stop at the vet's office. James had scheduled an early appointment, hoping to make it quick and still get to work on time. The waiting room was nearly empty, but Ranger's presence drew immediate attention from the staff. "My goodness," the receptionist said, staring at the puppy. "How old did you say he was?" "The shelter estimated about 5 months," James replied, watching as Ranger sat calmly beside Mia, ignoring the other dogs who barked from their carriers. Dr. Lim, a petite woman with kind eyes and practical shoes, seemed equally taken aback when she entered the exam room. She checked her clipboard twice. "This is the rescue from Ellen's shelter from just 3 days ago?" "That's right," James said, growing uneasy with her reaction. The vet ran through the standard examination, checking Ranger's teeth, eyes, and ears. The dog submitted to each test without a sound, not even a whimper when she drew blood for tests. "He's gained nearly 10 pounds since his shelter intake," she said, frowning at the scale. "That's unusual." "Is it bad?" James asked, checking his phone. He had a client call in 20 minutes that he was definitely going to miss. "Not necessarily." Dr. Lim stepped back, studying Ranger's profile. "He could be a shepherd mix, but I've never seen one this size at this age. His bone structure suggests he'll get much larger." She paused. "Has he shown any aggressive tendencies? Excessive barking?" James shook his head. "He doesn't bark at all, doesn't make a sound, actually. Just watches." Dr. Lim made some notes. "Well, he's healthy despite the unusual growth rate. Keep an eye on his food intake and we'll want to see him again in 2 weeks." By the time they left the vet's office, James had missed the client call entirely. He rushed Mia to school, then hurried to the co-working space, Ranger's mysterious size pushed to the back of his mind by work concerns. The afternoon brought new challenges. James picked Mia up early, not wanting to leave Ranger alone too long in the apartment. Their living space, which had seemed adequate for 2 people, now felt cramped with the addition of their rapidly growing companion. As they entered the apartment, Ranger's tail caught a lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise startled Mia, who pressed against the wall. Ranger immediately moved to her side, his huge body creating a barrier between her and the broken glass. "It's okay," James said quickly, cleaning up the mess. "No harm done." But the incident was followed by angry banging on the wall from their neighbors. James called out an apology through the wall, but his heart sank. The apartment building had a weight limit for dogs, one they'd already exceeded, and Ranger was nowhere near full grown. Dinner was a tense affair. Every time Ranger moved, something shifted or rattled. He was impossibly careful, moving with deliberate precision, but his size made it impossible to navigate the small space without impact. More banging came from the neighbors when his tail thumped against the shared wall. After Mia's bedtime routine, James faced a decision he'd been dreading. The baby gate had been sitting in its box since he'd bought it that afternoon. He knew it was necessary. They couldn't risk Ranger accidentally knocking something over during the night, but it felt wrong. Mia stood in her doorway, watching silently as James assembled the gate between the living room and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Her face was unreadable, but her hands twisted in the hem of her pajama top, a sure sign of distress. Ranger sat perfectly still, watching the gate go up without reaction. When James stepped back, the dog simply lay down against it, his massive body stretched along its length, eyes fixed unwaveringly on Mia's room. "It's just for nighttime," James explained, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Mia or himself. "He'll be more comfortable out here." Mia didn't respond. She just turned and went into her room, leaving the door open. Another change since Ranger's arrival. Before, she had insisted on it being closed and checked 3 times. James returned to his desk in the living room, opening his laptop to face the backlog of client work. His phone buzzed with another message from Rachel. "We need to talk tomorrow." He stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. Ranger hadn't moved from his position by the gate, his steady breathing the only sound in the apartment. Through the open door, James could see Mia's nightlight casting shadows on the wall. And for a moment, the scene felt frozen in time. A father trying to hold everything together, a silent child learning to trust again, and a mysterious dog who seemed to understand exactly what they both needed. The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick clouds as James hurried down the bustling Queen Street toward the coffee shop. His shoes tapped against the damp pavement, matching the quick rhythm of his heartbeat. Through the window, he could already see Rachel seated at a corner table, her laptop open and a steaming cup in front of her. The bell chimed as he pushed. "Open the door." Rachel looked up, her expression carefully neutral. She'd always been skilled at maintaining a professional demeanor, even when delivering bad news. "James," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her, "I ordered you a coffee, black, 2 sugars." "Thanks." He settled into the chair, his hands automatically wrapping around the warm cup. The familiar scent of coffee couldn't mask the tension in the air. Rachel closed her laptop with a soft click. "I'll get straight to the point. You've missed 3 deadlines in the past 2 weeks. The Miller account is threatening to walk." She paused, studying his face. "I've covered for you as much as I can, but—" "I know," James said, his voice rough. "Things have been complicated at home." "I understand that." Rachel's tone softened slightly. "But we're a small agency. We can't carry dead weight." She leaned forward. "1 more missed deadline and I'll have to move you to freelance status. That means no benefits, no insurance." The implications hit James like a physical blow. No insurance meant no therapy for Mia, no safety net if something went wrong. "I just need some time to get things sorted out," he said, hating how desperate he sounded. "You have a week," Rachel replied. "The Harrison project needs to be perfect and on time, no exceptions." James nodded, his coffee untouched and cooling. The morning rush swirled around them, people hurrying to their own jobs, their own problems, while his world threatened to crumble. When he returned to the apartment, the scene that greeted him was both comforting and concerning. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes fixed on the cartoon playing on TV. Ranger lay curved around her like a living fortress, his massive body forming a perfect semicircle. Neither of them acknowledged James's entrance. The dog had grown even more overnight. His shoulders now level with Mia's when she stood. The apartment seemed to shrink around his presence. Furniture that had once seemed adequate now appeared dollhouse-sized in comparison. James had just settled at his desk when a sharp knock rattled the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Foster, their downstairs neighbor, standing there with her arms crossed. Her face was pinched with annoyance, her grey hair perfectly set despite the early hour. "That dog of yours," she said without preamble, "sounds like a horse walking around up here. My ceiling fan rattles every time he moves." James glanced back at Ranger, who hadn't stirred from his position around Mia. "I'm sorry about the noise, Mrs. Foster. We're still adjusting." "Well, adjust faster," she interrupted. "This isn't a farm, it's an apartment building." She peered past him, eyes widening at the sight of Ranger. "Good Lord, how big is that thing?" "He's still growing," James admitted. "But I promise we'll keep him quieter." Mrs. Foster sniffed disapprovingly. "See that you do." She turned on her heel, muttering something about circus animals as she walked away. The afternoon stretched into evening, filled with the constant tap of keyboard keys as James tried to catch up on work. A small movement caught his attention. Mia had moved to the coffee table, her notebook open in front of her. She was drawing something, her crayon moving in determined strokes. After a few minutes, she stood up and walked to James's desk. Without a word, she placed the notebook in front of him. The drawing was simple. A large, somewhat circular shape with 4 legs and pointed ears. Despite its crude execution, it was unmistakably Ranger. James's throat tightened. It was the first thing she'd shown him voluntarily in months. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said softly. Mia didn't respond, but her fingers lingered on the paper for a moment before she returned to her spot next to Ranger. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, James pulled up the building's pet policy on his phone. His heart sank as he read the weight restriction, 50 pounds maximum. Ranger had to be at least 80 pounds already, and the vet's words about his continued growth echoed in James's mind. With heavy fingers, he began searching local rescue organizations. Each website felt like a betrayal. He made a few calls, his voice low, to avoid being heard through the thin walls. "Yes, I'm calling about possibly rehoming a large German Shepherd mix," he whispered into the phone. The responses varied, but each one left him feeling worse. "Too many large dogs already. Waitlist is 6 months. We don't have the space." The knot in his stomach grew with each call. How could he explain to Mia that they had to give up the one thing that had begun to bring her back? His dark thoughts were interrupted by a sound that made his blood run cold, a scream from Mia's room. Not just any scream, but one of pure terror, the kind he hadn't heard since the night they lost her mother. Before James could even stand, there was a tremendous crash. Ranger had launched himself at the baby gate, his powerful body smashing through it like it was made of paper. The dog disappeared down the hallway in a blur of motion, his nails clicking rapidly on the hardwood floor. James ran after him, his heart pounding. When he reached Mia's doorway, he stopped short at the sight before him. Ranger had somehow managed to curl his enormous body completely around Mia on her small bed. His head rested gently on her chest, rising and falling with her breathing, which was already starting to slow. Mia's hands were buried in his thick fur, her face pressed against his neck. As James watched, frozen in the doorway, Mia pulled back slightly. She looked into Ranger's eyes, which never left her face, and said in a voice cracked from disuse, "Ranger." James felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. The word hung in the air between them, more than just a name. It was a lifeline, a beginning, a small miracle in their tiny Queen's apartment. The morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. James stood quietly in the hallway, coffee cup warming his hands, watching a scene that made his heart squeeze with equal parts joy and disbelief. Mia lay on her stomach on the living room floor, her small frame dwarfed by Ranger's massive presence beside her. She held a blue marker in her hand, carefully tracing the outline of one of his enormous paws on a piece of paper. What caught James's attention wasn't the activity itself, but the soft whispers coming from his daughter. He couldn't make out the words. They were too quiet, meant only for Ranger's ears. But the sound of her voice, any voice, after so many months of silence, made his eyes burn with unshed tears. Ranger lay perfectly still, his dark eyes focused entirely on Mia as she worked. His tail would occasionally thump against the floor. When she spoke, a gentle acknowledgement of her words. The dog's patience seemed endless, his body completely relaxed despite being poked and prodded by the marker. James took a slow sip of his coffee, not daring to move closer for fear of breaking. The spell, Mia's whispers continued, a quiet stream of consciousness that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Ranger's ear would twitch occasionally, turning toward her voice as if catching every word was vital to his existence. Later that morning, James sat at his desk, staring at his phone. 3 numbers for different rescue organizations glowed on the screen, waiting to be called back. His finger hovered over the first one, but Mia's whispers from earlier echoed in his mind. With a decisive swipe, he deleted all 3 numbers. When the last rescue called to follow up, James's voice was firm. "We're keeping him." "Sir," the man on the end said, his tone cautious, "you should know that rehoming laws can get complicated with unregistered breeds. If there's ever an incident—" "There won't be," James interrupted, watching through his office doorway as Ranger gently nudged Mia's untouched breakfast plate closer to her. "But thank you for your concern." After ending the call, James dialed Dr. Sonia's office. The therapist picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and professional as always. "James, is everything all right?" "She's talking," he said, the words tumbling out. "Not much, and only around Ranger, but she's actually speaking." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Dr. Sonia asked, "Tell me more about these interactions." James described the morning. Scene, the whispers, the way Mia seemed to open up in Ranger's presence. He could hear Dr. Sonia taking notes through the phone. "This is significant progress," she said finally. "I'd like to integrate Ranger into our sessions if possible. Having him present might help Mia feel secure enough to communicate more openly." "You don't think he's too big for your office?" James asked. Dr. Sonia's voice held a smile. "I've worked with therapy horses. We'll manage with Ranger." After hanging up, James began researching dog training programs on his laptop. Most specialized in basic obedience or aggressive behavior modification, neither of which seemed to apply to Ranger's eerily calm demeanor. He bookmarked a few that focused on service dog training, thinking they might be more appropriate. That afternoon, James took Ranger for a longer walk than usual, trying to tire him out before their cramped evening in the apartment. Mia walked between them, one hand firmly gripping James's jacket, the other buried in Ranger's thick fur. The dog matched their pace perfectly, never pulling on the leash despite his enormous strength. People on the street couldn't help but stare. Ranger's size was impossible to ignore, and his appearance seemed to become more striking with each passing day. His coat had grown thicker, his chest deeper, his head more massive than any German shepherd James had ever seen. "Is that thing a wolf?" a man asked as they passed, keeping his distance. A woman walking her Labrador crossed the street early to avoid them, muttering, "That's not a shepherd." Ranger paid no attention to any of it. His focus remained entirely on Mia, his body consistently positioned between her and any passing strangers. When she stumbled on an uneven piece of sidewalk, he steadied her so smoothly it looked choreographed. Back in the apartment, Mia sat at the kitchen table, picking at her dinner. "Ranger likes carrots," she said softly, dropping one to the floor where the dog caught it gently. James nearly dropped his fork at the clear, unprompted sentence, the first she'd spoken to him directly since that night. "Does he?" he managed to reply, keeping his voice casual despite his pounding heart. Mia nodded but didn't say more. Still, she'd spoken to him, actually formed words meant for his ears. James felt like running around the apartment in celebration, but forced himself to stay seated, to act as if this was all perfectly normal. That evening, James gathered up the pieces of the broken baby gate from where he'd left them, propped against the wall. The plastic was completely shattered at the joints where Ranger had crashed through it the night before. He carried the whole mess to the trash chute, letting it fall away into the building's basement with a distant crash. When bedtime came, there was no discussion about where Ranger would sleep. The dog followed Mia into her room as naturally as a shadow, settling himself beside her bed like a furry guardian. His size made the small bedroom seem even tinier, but Mia's face showed nothing but contentment as she climbed under her covers. "Good night, Dad," she whispered. Just 2 words, but they hit James like a physical force. He gripped the door frame to steady himself. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered back. In his own room, James lay awake for a while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new normal. The soft whir of the fan, the distant city noise, and the occasional, subtle shift of Ranger's weight on Mia's floor. The apartment felt different now, cramped certainly, with barely enough space for their oversized addition. But it also felt warmer, somehow more complete. For the first time in almost a year, it felt like a home again. James's eyes grew heavy, his breathing evening out. No anxiety gripped his chest, no need to check on Mia every hour. Ranger was there, constant and watchful, and somehow that knowledge was enough. Sleep came easily, deep and unbroken, the first real rest he'd had in months. A week had passed. Since Mia first started speaking again, James sat at his makeshift desk in the kitchen, squinting at his laptop screen as he tried to focus on the client's design requirements. The sound of Mia's voice drifted in from the living room, soft but animated, a melody he thought he might never hear again. He couldn't help but glance over every few minutes. Ranger lay sprawled across most of the living room floor, his massive body completely still except for his eyes, which followed Mia's every movement. She had arranged a semicircle of picture books around his head and was telling him a story of her own creation, pointing to different illustrations as she went. "And then the butterfly found its way home," Mia whispered, her finger tracing the path across a page. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, acknowledging her words. James's vision blurred as he watched them. He quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not wanting Mia to catch him getting emotional. These moments felt precious, almost fragile, like soap bubbles that might pop if examined too closely. The apartment had changed dramatically with Ranger's presence. Dog fur covered every surface, no matter how often James vacuumed. The coffee table had been pushed against the wall to make more room, and several chairs had already been knocked over by Ranger's attempts to navigate the tight space. Their home felt like a dollhouse trying to contain a gentle giant. That afternoon, James took them both on their daily walk. Mia held onto his jacket with one hand while keeping the other buried in Ranger's thick fur. The dog moved with deliberate care, matching his pace to Mia's smaller steps. A man walking toward them stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, his eyes widening. "Hey, buddy," he called out to James. "Are you walking a bear?" Before James could respond, a woman pushing a stroller crossed the street to avoid them. "Is that even legal to have in the city?" she asked loudly, not waiting for an answer. James felt Mia's grip tighten on his jacket. Ranger didn't react to any of it. No growling, no barking, not even a change in his steady pace. He simply adjusted his position slightly, placing his body more firmly between Mia and the onlookers. As they continued their walk, James found himself studying Ranger more closely. The dog's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen before. When they passed other dogs who barked aggressively from apartment balconies, Ranger didn't even lift his head. He showed no interest in squirrels darting across their path or the hot dog cart on the corner. Instead, Ranger seemed to observe everything with an almost human-like awareness. His dark eyes tracked movement patterns, studied people's body language, monitored the flow of traffic. He never begged for treats or jumped up on furniture. He didn't whine to go out or bark at the door. He simply existed in their space like a silent guardian, his sole focus being Mia's safety and comfort. They passed the local dog park, where several dogs were playing. A golden retriever bounced around excitedly, chasing a tennis ball. A husky mix wrestled with a Labrador, both dogs barking joyfully. Mia paused to watch them, but Ranger showed no interest in joining their games. He stood patiently, his body angled to shield Mia from any dogs that might run too close to the fence. Back in the apartment that evening, James prepared dinner while Mia sat on the floor with Ranger. She had found an old brush in the bathroom cabinet and was carefully grooming his thick coat. The repetitive motions seemed to soothe them both. Mia humming softly while Ranger lay with his eyes half closed in contentment. James set their plates on the kitchen table, then paused as Mia spoke up. "He's not like the dogs at the park," she said thoughtfully, running the brush along Ranger's massive shoulder. James looked at his daughter, then at the enormous dog who had brought her voice back. Ranger lifted his head at that moment, meeting James's gaze with those intelligent eyes. He blinked slowly, almost like he was acknowledging the observation. "No," James replied gently, "he's not." The Saturday morning sun painted warm patches across the sidewalk as James, Mia, and Ranger made their way to the local park. Mia insisted on wearing her bright yellow raincoat despite the cloudless sky, its cheerful color making her look like a tiny sun bobbing along the concrete. James didn't argue. It was the first time she'd shown any preference in her clothing since her mother died. Ranger moved beside Mia with the precision of a trained guard, his massive frame creating a living wall between her and the street. The leash hung slack between them, unnecessary but required by law. James couldn't help but notice how the dog adjusted his stride to match Mia's shorter steps, how his head remained level and alert, scanning their surroundings with those intelligent eyes. People gave them a wide berth on the sidewalk. A jogger crossed to the other side of the street. A woman pulling a shopping cart quickened her pace as they passed. Ranger paid them no attention, his focus unwavering from his self-appointed duty. The park came into view, its worn playground equipment and patchy grass familiar to James from countless silent visits over the past year. Today felt different, though. Mia's shoulders weren't hunched forward like usual, and she actually tugged on James's sleeve, pointing toward the swings. As they entered the park, the reaction was immediate. Parents who had been chatting on benches suddenly gathered their children closer. A couple, walking their Yorkshire Terrier, swiftly altered their path. James felt the familiar burden of judgment and fear wrapping around them, heavy like a thick blanket. A group of boys, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, paused their game of catch to gawk at Ranger. James noticed them whispering and pointing, their faces contorted with a blend of fear and harsh curiosity. "Monster dog!" one of them yelled, while another boy snatched a stick from the ground and hurled it at Ranger. The stick bounced harmlessly off the pavement near Ranger's paws. James stepped forward, anger rising in his chest, but before he could speak, Mia moved in front of Ranger. She lifted her small hand like a crossing guard's stop sign, her yellow raincoat making the gesture seem almost authoritative. Her face, typically blank and downturned, was now fixed with resolve. The boys froze, visibly startled by this tiny girl defending the massive dog they had just tried to taunt. They exchanged uncertain glances, then bolted toward the basketball courts, casting confused looks over their shoulders as they fled. Mia turned to Ranger and patted his nose, as if to comfort him, though the dog hadn't even flinched at the stick or the shouting. He simply lowered his head to receive her touch, his eyes never leaving her face. James led them toward the playground area, his heart still pounding from the encounter. He picked a bench with a clear view of the swings where Mia had been looking earlier. To his surprise, she walked straight toward them, Ranger padding silently at her side. A younger girl, maybe 5 or 6, was already on one of the swings, pumping her legs with enthusiasm. Her mother sat nearby, typing on her phone. When she spotted Ranger, she began to stand, but something made her hesitate. Perhaps the way the dog moved, or how carefully he positioned himself near the swing set, or how Mia's small hand rested so confidently on his back. Mia climbed onto the empty swing, her raincoat bunching up around her waist. Ranger sat down precisely between her swing and the other girls, his posture vigilant, yet calm. The younger girl slowed her swinging to stare at him. "Is he nice?" she asked Mia, her voice carrying across the playground. James held his breath. Mia hadn't spoken to anyone but Ranger in so long. Mia nodded, then added in a soft but clear voice, "His name is Ranger." The other girl giggled. "He's big like a ranger." A faint smile crossed Mia's face as she began to pump her legs, gaining momentum. Ranger's head followed her movement, back and forth, like a gentle metronome. When she started spinning the swing in circles, twisting the chains together, Ranger stood up and moved closer. The chains suddenly unwound, sending Mia spinning rapidly. Just as she began to look dizzy, Ranger stretched his neck forward and nudged her leg with his nose, slowing her rotation. Mia threw her head back and laughed, a real laugh, bright, clear, and unexpected, like a bird taking flight. James felt his chest tighten. He hadn't heard that sound in so long. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear his daughter laugh. The other girl joined in, and soon both children were spinning in their swings, waiting for Ranger to nudge them back to stillness. The dog moved between them with gentle patience, touching each girl's leg in turn, earning peals of laughter. Each time, for a moment, everything felt all right. The sun was warm, his daughter was laughing, and the massive dog that had changed their lives stood guard over her joy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. James could almost believe this was normal, that they were just another family enjoying a Saturday morning at the park. Later that evening, Mia fell asleep early, exhausted from her first real day of play in months. James found himself sitting at his desk, staring at Ranger's adoption papers in the dim light of his laptop screen. The breed section simply read, "Shepherd Mix," a vague label that had seemed plausible enough at the time. He opened a new browser, tab, and began researching German Shepherd growth patterns and behaviors. Tab after tab filled his screen as he delved deeper. Average weights, temperaments, training tendencies. Nothing quite matched what he saw in Ranger. The size was off, the behavior patterns didn't align, and even the physical characteristics seemed wrong now that he really examined them. James glanced over at Ranger, who lay in his usual spot near Mia's door. The dog's massive head rested on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching James with that same intelligent, almost knowing expression. In the shadows of the apartment, his size seemed even more striking, his presence more enigmatic. Turning back to his laptop, James continued his research late into the night, an uneasy feeling growing in his stomach with each new piece of information that didn't quite fit. James juggled the grocery bags as he fumbled for his keys, nearly dropping the carton of milk. The hallway's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn carpet. He froze when he saw Mr. Vargas standing outside his apartment door, arms folded across his chest like a sentinel. The retired cop's face was set in stern lines, his police academy posture still evident after all these years. Through the door, James heard something he'd never heard before, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on his neck stand up. "Your dog's been making that sound for 10 minutes, Vargas said, his voice clipped and professional. "Started right after I knocked." James fumbled with his keys again, this time with urgency. As he opened the door, he saw Mia kneeling beside Ranger, her small hands wrapped around his thick collar. The dog's massive head was lowered, eyes fixed on Vargas. That deep growl continued, vibrating through the apartment like distant thunder. "Ranger," James said softly, setting the groceries down. "It's okay." Mia was whispering something in Ranger's ear, her face pressed close to his fur. The dog's ears twitched at her words, but his focus remained unchanged. "That's no German shepherd," Vargas said, staying in the doorway. His hand rested near his hip. An old habit, James realized, from carrying a service weapon. "I worked K9 unit for 15 years. I know every breed they use, every mix, every variant. That's something else entirely." James stepped between Vargas and his daughter. "He's never shown any aggression, not once. He's gentle with Mia. He's gentle." Vargas cut him off with a sharp laugh. "You think calm means safe? Listen to me carefully, Mr. Carter. That dog is going to keep growing. He's already way over building regulations, but more importantly, he's not what you think he is." Mia's whispers grew more urgent. Her fingers white-knuckled on Ranger's collar. The dog hadn't moved an inch, but his growl deepened when Vargas took a step forward. "You're gambling with a child's life," Vargas continued, his voice heavy with authority. "I've seen what happens when people keep animals they don't understand, when they mistake stillness for domestication." He pointed at Ranger. "That's no pet, and if you don't get him out of here, I will. Animal control needs one call from a concerned citizen, especially one with a law enforcement background." James felt his daughter's eyes on him, felt the weight of Ranger's presence, felt the threat in Vargas's words. "He's registered with the city," he said, but his voice sounded weak, even to himself. "We have papers. Papers that list him as a shepherd mix." Vargas shook his head. "Take a good look at him, Mr. Carter, really look. You know I'm right." He turned to leave, then paused. "You have 48 hours to make arrangements. After that, I'm making the call." The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the apartment. Ranger's growl faded, but he remained stationed by Mia, his body tense and alert. That night, after a dinner where nobody ate much, James tried to coax Ranger away from his vigilant post by the front door. The dog had been sitting there for hours, staring at the hallway beyond, as if he could see through the wood. His massive frame seemed even larger in the narrow entryway, his presence both reassuring and, after Vargas's words, somehow unsettling. "Come on, boy," James said softly, offering one of the new treats he'd bought. "Everything's okay." Ranger glanced at him, then returned to his watch. There was something different about him tonight, an intensity that hadn't been there before, as if Vargas's threat had awakened something primitive and protective in him. Mia sat on the couch, her homework untouched on the coffee table. She hadn't spoken since Vargas left, but James could see the worry etched across her face. It was the same look she'd worn after her mother died, when the world had suddenly become an uncertain place. "Will they take him away?" she asked finally, her voice small and fragile. James crossed the room and sat beside her, pulling her close. "No, sweetheart, they won't." But his voice cracked on the last word, betraying his uncertainty. Mia buried her face in his shirt, and he felt her shoulders shake slightly. "I promise," he whispered, but the words felt hollow. He looked at Ranger, still guarding the door with unwavering focus, and wondered what else he didn't know about their silent protector. Later, after Mia had finally fallen asleep, James sat at his desk and opened his laptop. His hands hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before he began typing an email to the shelter where they'd found Ranger. "I need any additional information you might have about his background," he wrote. "Anything that might have been overlooked or seemed unimportant at the time. His size, his breed, his behavior, none of it matches typical shepherd characteristics. Please help me understand what he is." The reply came surprisingly quickly, just 3 short lines. "Found tied up behind warehouse. No chip. Previous owner. Likely dumped him. Shelter was full. We made our best guess on breed. Sorry, we can't be more help." James stared at the response, then at his draft email to the local rescue center about rehoming options. His cursor hovered over the send button. He thought about Mia's laughter at the park, about her voice returning after months of silence, about Ranger's quiet vigilance and unwavering devotion. He selected the entire draft and pressed delete. Whatever Ranger was, whatever challenges lay ahead, James had made his choice. They were family now, and families stuck together. The weekend arrived with a gentle morning mist hanging over Queens. James clipped Ranger's leash on at 6 a.m., when the streets were still quiet enough to hear distant subway rumbles. Mia sat cross-legged in the living room, carefully stacking wooden blocks into what looked like a castle. "We'll be back in 15 minutes, sweetie," James said, watching her nod without looking up. Her focus remained on balancing a rectangular block on top of her creation. Ranger stood patiently by the door, his massive frame filling the narrow hallway. He'd grown even larger over the past weeks, his shoulders now reaching James's hip. The leash looked almost comical against his thick neck, like trying to restrain a bear with a piece of string. The early morning air felt crisp as they made their way down the stairs. James had started these dawn walks to avoid the stares and whispers that came later in the day. At this hour, the courtyard belonged to them alone. Just the sound of their footsteps and the occasional flutter of pigeons. Ranger moved with his usual careful grace, each step measured despite his size. He never pulled on the leash, never rushed ahead. Instead, he matched James's pace perfectly, staying close enough that James could feel the warmth radiating from his thick coat. They were halfway through their usual route when James heard the jingling of another dog's collar. Around the corner came Caleb, struggling to control Blaze, his muscular pit bull. The dog's chain leash rattled as he strained forward, already growling at the sight of them. "Hey!" Caleb called out, his voice too loud for the quiet morning. "Better keep that mutt away from my champion." He yanked Blaze's leash, making the pit bull's collar jingle more frantically. James felt Ranger tense beside him, but remained perfectly still. The dog's eyes fixed on Blaze, watching with that same studying gaze he gave everything else. "Morning, Caleb," James said quietly, steering Ranger toward the far side of the courtyard. He'd learned to avoid confrontations with Caleb, who seemed to take pride in Blaze's aggressive reputation. "That's right, keep walking," Caleb laughed, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Your monster knows better than to mess with a real guard dog." Ranger didn't react to the taunt, didn't even turn his head as they passed. James felt a surge of pride mixed with uncertainty. Caleb was right about one thing. Ranger wasn't a normal dog, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. They finished their walk quickly and headed back upstairs. Mia had abandoned her blocks and now sat at the window, her small face pressed against the glass. Ranger immediately went to her, settling his huge body beside her chair and resting his head on the windowsill. His ears twitched forward as Mia began to speak. "Once there was a giant mountain dog," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet apartment. "He lived way up high where the stars fell from the sky." Her hand absently stroked Ranger's fur as she continued. "One day, a little girl was climbing the mountain to catch falling stars, but she slipped on the ice. James stood in the doorway, listening to his daughter's story. Her voice grew stronger as she described how the mountain dog caught the girl before she could fall, how he carried her safely down through storms and darkness. Ranger's eyes never left her face as she spoke, his attention complete and unwavering. The morning passed peacefully. James caught up on work while Mia drew pictures of her mountain dog story, Ranger watching over her shoulder. Around 2 Saiters, Mia asked to go pick dandelions in the courtyard, something she'd started doing recently, to make wishes on the seeds. "Stay where I can see you from the window," James reminded her as she headed downstairs. Ranger got up to follow, but James called him back. "Let her have a few minutes, boy. She's right below us." Mia's yellow raincoat made her easy to spot as she crouched in the patchy grass, carefully selecting the puffiest dandelions. James watched her for a moment, then turned back to his laptop. The sound of shouting jerked his attention back to the window. "Blaze, Blaze, get back here!" James's heart stopped. Through the window he saw Caleb's pit bull sprinting across the courtyard, chain leash dragging behind him. The dog's teeth were bared, his powerful body aimed directly at Mia, who stood frozen with a handful of dandelions. Before James could move, there was a tremendous crash behind him. Ranger had launched himself through the screen door, tearing it from its frame. The massive dog cleared the exterior stairs in 2 impossible bounds, his body moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. James ran for the stairs as Ranger intercepted Blaze mid-charge. The 2 dogs collided with a force that should have resulted in savage fighting, but that's not what happened. Instead, Ranger simply pinned Blaze to the ground, using his superior weight and size with precise control. He made no sound. Didn't bare his teeth or shake the smaller dog. He just held him there, immobile and quiet. James reached Mia and scooped her up, his heart pounding. She clung to him, dandelions still clutched in one hand. Caleb came running across the courtyard, his face red with rage. "Get your monster off my dog!" he screamed, waving his arms. "He's attacking Blaze. Did everyone see that? Your dog attacked. Mine!" People began emerging from the building, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Foster stood on her balcony in her bathrobe, phone already out. Mr. Vargas appeared at the entrance, his expression grim. Ranger continued holding Blaze down, silent and still, until Caleb managed to grab his dog's dragging leash. Only then did the massive dog release his hold, backing away smoothly to stand beside James and Mia. Blaze scrambled up, no longer growling, and pressed against Caleb's legs. James held Mia tighter as neighbors gathered around them, their voices rising in confused debate about what they'd witnessed. Caleb's face was getting redder as he pointed at Ranger, shouting about dangerous animals and lawsuits. But James couldn't focus on any of it. His hands were shaking too badly, his mind stuck on what might have happened if Ranger hadn't been there. An hour after the incident, the apartment felt like it was holding its breath. 2 animal control officers stood in the cramped living room, their navy uniforms stark against the faded wallpaper. Officer Torres, the senior officer, flipped through her paperwork, while her partner, Officer Quan, kept a wary eye on Ranger. The massive dog sat perfectly still in the corner, his bulk making the space seem even smaller. Mia had her arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in his thick fur. "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay," she whispered over and over, the words flowing together like a prayer. "Sir, we understand this is difficult," Officer Torres said, her tone professional but not unkind. "But we have to follow protocol when there's a reported incident involving a dog of this size." James ran his hands through his hair, fighting to keep his voice steady. "But Ranger didn't attack anyone. He protected my daughter from an off-leash dog that was charging at her. Ask any of the neighbors who saw." "We did," Officer Quan cut in. "No one seems to have a clear view of what happened, and Mr. Caleb is insisting your dog attacked his unprovoked." "Caleb?" James's voice cracked with disbelief. His pit bull broke free and ran straight at my 8-year-old daughter, Ranger. "Just held him down. He didn't even bite." Officer Torres sighed, tucking her paperwork into a folder. "Without security footage or witnesses willing to make statements, we have to treat this as a potential aggressive incident. The law requires a 72-hour behavioral assessment for any dog over 70 pounds involved in an altercation." Mia's whispers grew louder, more desperate. "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay." Ranger remained motionless, except for his eyes, which tracked every movement the officers made. Officer Kwan approached with a heavy-duty leash. Ranger's muscles tensed visibly, and the officer hesitated. The dog's size was even more apparent as he rose slightly, his head level with the officer's chest, even while sitting. "Mia, sweetie," James said softly, "you need to step back now." Mia's fingers tightened in Ranger's fur. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as she shook her head frantically. "Just for 3 days," James tried to assure her, though his own voice trembled. "Just until they see how good he is." Officer Kwan moved forward again with the leash. This time, Ranger shifted his weight, a low rumble building in his chest. The officer quickly stepped back. "Sir, if the dog shows any aggression, we'll have to use additional restraints," Officer Torres warned. But before James could respond, Mia's tear-streaked face turned to Ranger. "Stay," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. Immediately, Ranger relaxed. The rumble in his chest died away. He lowered his head, allowing Officer Kwan to clip the leash to his collar without resistance. Mia stumbled back into James's arms as the officers led Ranger toward the door. The dog moved with his usual careful grace, but his eyes never left Mia's face. Even as they guided him down the hallway, he kept looking back until they turned the corner. The moment Ranger disappeared from view, Mia went completely still in James's arms. Her tears stopped, her face emptied of expression. James recognized the blank mask she'd worn for months after her mother died. With shaking hands, James pulled out his phone and called Dr. Sonia's office. After 2 rings, her familiar voice answered. "Dr. Sonia, it's James Carter. They took Ranger. Animal control took him for assessment. Mia's—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Take a deep breath, James," Dr. Sonia said calmly. "Tell me exactly what happened." He explained the morning's events in rushed sentences, his free hand stroking Mia's hair as she stood motionless beside him. When he finished, Dr. Sonia was quiet for a moment. "The most important thing right now is keeping Mia's routine as normal as possible," she said finally. "Don't let her see your panic. Make dinner, talk to her like you usually would. Ranger has been a breakthrough in her therapy, but we don't want her to feel like she's losing everything again." James nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "Yes, okay, normal routine. I can do that." After hanging up, he guided Mia to the kitchen table, where he'd laid out dinner earlier. Simple pasta with marinara sauce, Mia's favorite. But she just sat there, staring at the plate without moving. James tried to eat, tried to make conversation, but each bite felt like swallowing sand. Mia didn't touch her food, didn't respond to his gentle questions, didn't even look up. When he cleared the table, his hands shook as he scraped the untouched pasta into the trash. The sound of the garbage disposal seemed too loud in the silent apartment. Everything seemed too loud now. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens outside, the beating of his own heart. When bedtime came, Mia walked to her room without protest. She climbed into bed, fully dressed, turned to face the wall, and went still. James stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, remembering all the nights he'd done this after her mother died. Later, he sat in the hallway outside her room, his laptop balanced on his knees. Ranger's empty bed lay beside him, the worn blanket still holding the impression of the dog's massive form. The sight made his chest ache. With trembling fingers, he typed into the search bar, "What to do when your dog is taken by animal control." The results filled his screen: legal advice, horror stories, warnings about breed restrictions. He clicked, link after link, reading about appeal processes and behavioral evaluations, his vision blurring as exhaustion and worry took their toll. From Mia's room, there was only silence. No movement, no sound. The quiet felt heavier than Ranger's presence ever had, weighing down the apartment like a physical thing. James stared at the screen until the words began to swim together. The empty dog bed beside him seemed to grow larger in his peripheral. Vision, becoming a black hole that threatened to swallow everything they'd gained in the past weeks. Mia's voice, her smile, their fragile new normal. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to hold back the tide of fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm him. The laptop screen continued to glow in the darkness, offering no real answers, while the silence from Mia's room stretched on endlessly. The fluorescent lights of the animal control facility buzzed overhead as James stood at the front desk, his fingers drumming against the scratched surface. The clock on the wall showed 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before closing time. "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist repeated, her voice tired but firm. "We can't allow visitation during behavioral assessment periods. It's protocol." "He's been here for 24 hours already," James said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I just want to check on him. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." The woman shook her head. "The observation period is 72 hours minimum, no exceptions. The handlers need to evaluate the dog's behavior without owner interaction." James's hand curled into a fist against the desk. "His name is Ranger," he said quietly, "and he's never spent a night away from my daughter. He's probably not eating." "Sir," she cut him off, "I understand you're concerned, but these rules exist for everyone's safety. You can call tomorrow afternoon for an update on his status." The fluorescent lights continued their endless hum as James stood there, feeling helpless. Through a door behind the desk, he could hear the distant sound of dogs barking. Somewhere in there was Ranger, alone in a strange place, probably wondering why they'd abandoned him. Finally, James turned away from the desk. In the parking lot, he sat in his car and pulled out his phone. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through his contacts and found Ellen's number from the shelter. She answered on the third ring. "Hello, Ellen. It's James Carter. I adopted Ranger from you about a month ago." "Oh, yes, the big guy." Her voice warmed with recognition. "How's he doing with— Wait, is everything okay?" James explained the situation, his words tumbling out faster as he described the incident with Blaze, the animal control officers, the denied visitation. Ellen listened without interrupting. "That's rough," she said when he finished. "Look, I know some people at animal control. Let me make a few calls, see if I can help smooth things over. No promises, but anything would help," James said. "Mia hasn't spoken since they took him. She's just gone again." "I'll do what I can," Ellen promised. "Give me until tomorrow morning." After hanging up, James sat in his car, watching the facility's lights gleam in the growing darkness. He couldn't go home yet, couldn't face Mia's empty eyes, the silence of their apartment, Ranger's abandoned bed. The parking lot slowly emptied as the facility's closing time approached. James watched employees leave one by one, their shadows long in the security lights. As the last few cars pulled away, he noticed a familiar figure walking toward the side entrance. Nico, the night janitor. He'd helped design a simple website for his side business last year. Without thinking, James got out of his car. "Nico!" The man turned, recognition lighting his face. "Hey, James, what brings you here?" James jogged over, his heart pounding. "Nico, I need a huge favor. My dog's in there. They took him yesterday. They won't let me see him." Nico's friendly expression turned uncertain. "Man, I don't know. I could get in serious trouble." 5 minutes! James Carter pleaded. "Just 5 minutes to check on him, please. My daughter hasn't spoken since they took him. She's 8, Daniel. She lost her mom last year, and now—" Daniel glanced at the building, then back at James. After a long moment, he sighed. 5 minutes, that's it. And if anyone asks, you snuck in while I was cleaning the lobby." Inside, the facility was eerily quiet compared to the daytime barking. Their footsteps echoed on the linoleum as Daniel led James through a maze of hallways to the observation kennels. "End of the row," Daniel whispered. "The big one. I've got to get back to work. 5 minutes, okay?" James nodded gratefully, then made his way down the dimly lit corridor. Most of the kennels were empty or contained sleeping dogs, but in the last one, a massive shape moved slowly back and forth in the shadows. Ranger was pacing, his movements careful even in the confined space. An untouched bowl of food sat in the corner. The dog's head was low, his usual alertness replaced by something that looked like resignation. James knelt by the thick glass wall. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Ranger stopped mid-pace. His head came up sharply, ears forward. He turned toward James's voice and walked to the glass, each step deliberate and controlled, despite his obvious excitement. The dog pressed one enormous paw against the barrier, his eyes locked on James's face. There was something in that gaze, something that made James's throat tight, not just recognition or relief, but a deep, wordless understanding. James placed his hand against the glass, matching Ranger's paw. "I'm not giving up," he whispered fiercely. "We're getting you home. Mia needs you. We both do." Ranger didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just kept his paw pressed against the glass, staring at James with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. The moments stretched between them, heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Too soon, James heard Daniel's footsteps approaching. With a final whispered promise, he stood and walked away. Each step felt like betrayal, but he forced himself not to look back. The drive home seemed longer than usual. Every traffic light lasted an eternity. Every song on the radio felt wrong. James's hand still tingled where he'd pressed it against the glass, reaching for Ranger's paw. When he opened the apartment door, the silence hit him like a physical force. Mia was exactly where he'd left her, curled on the couch under her favorite blanket, Ranger's collar clutched in her small hands. She didn't look up when he entered. James crossed the room and knelt beside the couch. Mia's face was turned toward the cushions, but he could see she was awake. Her fingers traced the metal tag on Ranger's collar over and over like a worry stone. "I saw him," James said softly. "He's okay. He misses you." Mia's fingers stilled on the collar tag. "We're getting him back," James promised, his voice firm, despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. "No matter what it takes." There was no response, no acknowledgement that she'd heard him. But as James watched, Mia pulled the blanket tighter. Around herself, her grip on Ranger's collar never loosening. She was holding on, to the collar, to hope, to the fragile thread of connection that Ranger had helped her find. James stayed kneeling beside the couch, watching his daughters. A quiet battle to keep believing, to keep holding on. The apartment's silence pressed in around them like a living thing, broken only by the soft sound of Mia's fingers moving across Ranger's collar tag, spelling out his name again and again in the darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows across James's kitchen table as he hunched over his laptop, a forgotten cup of coffee growing cold beside his mousepad. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but his fingers moved with purpose as he navigated to a pet DNA testing website. The site promised results in 72 hours, with an emergency option for 48-hour processing. James didn't hesitate. He clicked the express option and entered his credit card information, wincing slightly at the price but not letting it stop him. Time was too precious right now. He retrieved Mia's blue grooming brush from the bathroom cabinet, carefully collecting the thick strands of Ranger's fur that still clung to the bristles. The fur was dense and slightly coarse, nothing like a German shepherd's coat. James had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this wasn't adding up. Now he needed proof. Following the testing kit's instructions, he sealed the fur samples in the provided envelope. Within an hour, a courier arrived to collect it, whisking away what James hoped would be a crucial piece of evidence in bringing Ranger home. As the morning wore on, James moved through the building, knocking on doors. Many neighbors quickly shut him out, not wanting to get involved, but Emily from 2D, a young art student who often sketched in the courtyard, invited him in immediately. "I saw everything," she said, settling at her small desk. That pit bull was always aggressive, lunging at kids, straining at his leash. But Ranger, she shook her head as she began writing her statement, he just held Blaze down. No biting, no growling, like a bouncer at a club, you know? Just control. James watched as she detailed the incident, her handwriting neat and clear. When she finished, she signed it with a flourish and added her apartment number and contact information. Mia used to be so quiet, Emily said as she handed him the paper. But lately, I'd hear her talking to Ranger through the walls. Actually, talking, that has to count for something, right? James thanked her, carefully adding her statement to his growing folder. In the hallway, he nearly bumped into Mr. Lee from 3A, who usually kept to himself. That other dog, Mr. Lee said quietly, glancing around before continuing, always seemed unstable. My wife wouldn't walk our cat past their door, but your dog, very controlled, very mindful. He wrote a brief but clear statement, his hands shaking slightly as he signed it. By early afternoon, James had collected 4 statements supporting Ranger's non-aggressive behavior. He called Dr. Sonia's office, explaining the situation. Her response was immediate and supportive. I'll have a letter to you within the hour, she promised. The therapeutic impact Ranger has had on Mia is remarkable, and this separation, she paused, her concern evident even through the phone. The regression is significant. Mia needs stability right now, not another loss. James sat at his desk, organizing the growing pile of documents. Dr. Sonia's letter arrived by email, professionally formatted on her letterhead. She detailed Mia's progress with Ranger present, the return of speech, improved emotional regulation, decreased anxiety, and the sharp decline since his removal. The afternoon light was fading when James's laptop chimed with a new email. The DNA results had arrived far earlier than expected. His hands trembled slightly as he clicked the link. The page loaded slowly, revealing a detailed breakdown. James's eyes widened as he read, Primary breed composition, 75% Caucasian Ovchaka, 25% domestic mix, unable to specify due to genetic diversity. Additional notes, Caucasian Ovchakas, also known as Georgian shepherd dogs, are an ancient breed traditionally used to protect children and livestock in harsh environments. When properly socialized, they display strong protective instincts without unnecessary aggression. Their size and appearance can be intimidating, but their temperament is typically calm and devoted, especially toward children in their care. James sat back, his mind racing. Everything suddenly made sense. Ranger's size, his quiet vigilance, his instant connection with Mia, his controlled response to Blaze. He wasn't just some random mixed breed. He was exactly what Mia needed, what they both needed. Working quickly, James printed everything, the DNA results, neighbor statements, Dr. Sonia's letter, photos of Mia and Ranger together, documentation of Mia's progress since adoption. He organized it all in a clear folder, adding tabs for easy reference during the appeal. His hands moved automatically as he booked the earliest available slot for a formal appeal with the Animal Control Board at 9 a.m. the next morning. The confirmation email arrived instantly, making it real. That evening, James sat on the edge of Mia's bed, the folder clutched in his hands. She hadn't moved much all day, but now she turned slightly toward him, her small fingers still wrapped around Ranger's collar. Is Ranger cold? She whispered, her voice rough from disuse. James's heart clenched at the simple question, at all the worry and love behind it. He reached out and smoothed her hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle. Not for long, he answered, his voice steady and sure. The morning dawned grey and cold, the kind of November chill that seemed to seep straight through James's coat as he climbed the worn stone steps of the municipal building. His breath came out in small clouds, and the leather binder under his arm felt heavy with the weight of everything it contained, and everything that depended on it. Inside, The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the institutional beige walls. James checked in at a desk where a tired-looking clerk directed him to room 204. His dress shoes clicked against the linoleum floor as he walked down the empty hallway, each step echoing like a countdown. The meeting room was smaller than he'd expected. A long table dominated the space, behind which sat three people: a woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as the animal control supervisor, a city legal representative with wire-rimmed glasses, and a veterinary consultant who barely looked. Up from his notepad, James took his seat across from them, grateful for the table that hid his trembling hands. "Mr. Carter," the supervisor began, her voice professional but not unkind, "we're here to review your appeal regarding the dog currently designated as case number A4447, brought in for aggressive behavior assessment following an incident on November 12th. Please present your case." James opened his binder, forcing his fingers to be steady as he arranged his documents. He started with the basics: Ranger's adoption papers, vet records, proof of vaccines. Then he pulled out his phone, queuing up a video he'd taken just weeks ago. "Before I get into the technical details," he said, his voice stronger than he felt, "I'd like you to see something." He pressed play. The screen showed Mia sitting on their living room floor, surrounded by stuffed animals. She was speaking softly but clearly to Ranger, who lay beside her like a gentle giant, his eyes fixed on her face as she told him a story about each toy. The panel watched in silence. "My daughter, Mia, hasn't spoken for almost a year," James explained, his throat tight. "Not since her mother died. This video was taken 3 weeks after we adopted Ranger. He brought her voice back." He laid out Dr. Sonia's letter next, sliding copies across the table. The legal representative picked it up first, adjusting his glasses as he read aloud key passages about Mia's remarkable progress and the therapeutic bond she'd formed with Ranger. "Regarding the incident itself," James continued, pulling out the neighbor statements. "Several witnesses saw what actually happened. Ranger didn't attack, he protected. The other dog, Blaze, was off-leash and charging toward my daughter. Ranger intercepted him and held him down. No biting, no aggression, just control." The veterinary consultant finally looked up. His interest apparently piqued. "That level of restraint is unusual in a standard protection response," he noted. "Because Ranger isn't a standard dog," James replied, reaching for the DNA results. "This report came in yesterday. Ranger is 75% Caucasian Ovcharka, a breed specifically developed to protect children and livestock. They're known for their size, yes, but more importantly, for their discernment and controlled protective instincts." The supervisor leaned forward, examining the breed information with newfound interest. "This changes the classification significantly," she admitted. "Ovcharkas are recognized working dogs, not restricted breeds in our jurisdiction." Just then, the door opened. Mr. Vargas stepped in, his presence unexpected and commanding. The retired officer nodded briefly to the panel. "I'd like to speak, if that's permitted," he said, his gruff voice filling the small room. The supervisor gestured for him to continue, though James noticed her straightening slightly at Vargas's professional bearing. "I was wrong about that dog," Vargas stated plainly. "I'm the one who first raised concerns about him. 30 years on the force, I thought I knew dangerous animals. But that dog, he never barked, never lunged, just watched closely like he knew something we didn't." He paused, his weathered face serious. "Now I know what he knew. That little girl needed him. Still does." The panel exchanged glances. The supervisor gathered the documents, standing up. "We'll need to deliberate. Please wait outside." James found himself in the hallway, sitting on a hard plastic chair as minutes crawled by. He checked his phone. No messages from the neighbor watching Mia. He thought about Ranger in that kennel, waiting. About Mia at home, silent again. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 40 minutes passed before the door opened. The supervisor gestured him back inside. James's heart pounded as he took his seat once more. "Mr. Carter," she began, "we've reviewed all the evidence thoroughly. The DNA results confirm this is a recognized working breed with specific protective traits. The witness statements support your account of the incident. Dr. Sonia's assessment of the dog's therapeutic impact is particularly compelling." She paused, shuffling some papers. "The board has decided to release the dog back into your custody, with the understanding that you'll register him properly as a Caucasian Ovcharka mix and maintain current documentation." James's breath caught in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say. "When?" "You can pick him up immediately," she replied, already signing the release forms. "The holding facility has been notified." The drive to the facility passed in a blur. This time, when James walked through the doors, no one stopped him. A young kennel worker greeted him with a smile and a clipboard of release forms. "He's been so quiet," she said as she led James to the back. "Most dogs bark or whine, but he just watched. Wouldn't eat much either." They turned a corner, and there was Ranger, lying in his kennel with his massive head on his paws. His eyes looked dim until they landed on James. In an instant, the dog was on his feet, his tail moving in two slow, deliberate wags. The worker unlatched the door, holding out a leash. "He's all yours." James's hands were steady now as he clipped the leash to Ranger's collar. Together they walked through the facility and out into the cold morning air. Ranger moved close to James's side, their steps falling into perfect rhythm. At the car, James pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to Mia. "He's coming home." 2 months had passed like a gentle exhale, winter settling over their Vermont home. Morning light caught snow-covered pines, casting shadows across the white landscape. Their cabin nestled among trees, smoke curling from the stone chimney against the blue sky. Mia's laughter cut through the stillness as she sat on a wooden sled in her red coat, Ranger pulling it with a rope in his jaws, his winter-thickened fur making him appear even larger. "Again!" Mia called, cheeks pink with excitement. Ranger acknowledged with a blink before continuing their circuit. Inside, James watched from his desk while working. His tension from Queens had melted away. After the animal control incident, they'd needed more space. The cabin appeared like an answer, remote yet accessible. The elderly owner practically gave it away upon seeing Mia with Ranger. James's freelance work improved without office politics. Mia transformed remarkably, growing confident with remote therapy and homeschooling. She loved reading by the fireplace. Ranger adapted perfectly. James developed hand signals instead of traditional training methods, which Ranger understood with uncanny intelligence. He remained Mia's silent guardian, offering support during her sessions with Dr. Sonia. As afternoon faded and snow fell, Mia settled beneath the pine tree on her array of blankets and cushions. Ranger joined her as she read a wilderness adventure, a book, positioning it for him to see the illustrations. Through the window, James heard her stronger voice, reading confidently. The mountain stood tall against the sky, and the explorer knew she had found her home. Ranger listened attentively, shifting closer. Watching them, James felt his heart swell. They thought they had saved an abandoned dog, but seeing Mia's confident voice where once was silence, he knew the truth. They thought they saved him, but it was always the other way around. If you enjoyed the story of Ranger, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.